Sten, we're live.
Hey, thank you, Larry Liberty Guy. This is Mike Stenhouse, your host of In the Dugout. Welcome to another summer special edition. In fact, this is a busy week. We're going to be doing shows 4 days this week, which is above our normal, but there's so much important stuff going on that you need to learn about. 8 months. Well, let me first say this. To this, we've come. You've heard me say this before, and I'm going to explain it again. But here we are. We've come to this point. 8 months after the FDA, issued its first emergency authorization for the Pfizer and other vaccines. As you know, earlier this week, the FDA announced full approval for vaccines for Americans 16 years and older. And immediately following, which is what all the big government control freaks are waiting for, and all those who think they know what's best for your lives, immediately they sprang into action, as there were dozens and dozens of announcements all over the country by governments, by entities who would now be requiring school districts, colleges, businesses, corporations, whoever, students, faculty, to receive the mandated jab, if you would. Even New York City now, all 150,000 or so Department of Education employees are going to be required, just among one example. And it's happening here in Rhode Island as well, as we'll be talking about probably today and certainly on tomorrow's show. As was presaged, to this we've come. So in that regard, I want to play, again, bear with me, watch this. This is 2.5 minutes. It's the aria performed by our friend Claire Stoutmuller from an opera in the 1940s about the totalitarianism that existed in Italy and Eastern Europe at that time, or that was starting to dominate. To this we've come. Here is the aria. Let me go back and start from the beginning. That would be helpful.
Stranger upon God's earth, that he be chosen without a chance for choice.
Chosen without a chance for choice. Mandates. Get the vaccine. Wear the masks. No choice. And if not, you'll be hunted down.
That he be haunted without
government wants to take over as the entity that must be worshipped in place of God. That's where we are. To this we've come.
Tell me, secretary, tell me, who are these men? If to them, not to God, we now must pray. Tell me, secretary, tell me. Will they be conquered? Will they be doomed?
They'll be conquered and doomed only if we stand together and push back.
I ask you for help, and all you give me is papers. What is your name? What is your rank? Age 33, color of voice, color of hair, single married, religion or race, place of birth, mother's name, papers, 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 papers.
Papers. Does anyone doubt this? Claire made this over a year ago. How prescient. She saw this coming. She sang about it. And you know what? They saw this coming in the 1940s as well. So, excuse me while I get reorganized here. So, to this we've come, and we're going to be talking about today with our guest, Dr. Andrew Bostom, who's going to be brought on in just a minute. Yesterday, hope you saw our show, was really a news-breaking show with Representative Charlene Lima and Representative Brian Newberry. I mean, Representative Lima is part of Democrat leadership, and she openly challenged the governor's what she called ridiculous and absurd new declared state of emergency. And she's going to be requesting of the speaker that a session be called, presumably right after Labor Day. I don't know if she'll be successful with it. Says she has allies to try to end lawfully, the unlawful, I should say, state of emergency declared by the governor last week. So we'll see what happens there. But go to rifreedom.org/live and watch yesterday's video with Representative Lima. Tomorrow, similarly, we're going to have pretty much a whole show on what happened in Gloucester on Monday night, who again openly defied the governor's emergency powers, pretty much openly defied the Rhode Island Department of Education. We'll talk about that with a concerned citizen who lives in Gloucester, and hopefully also with Chaz Kalenda. He's an attorney. He's an announced candidate for Rhode Island Attorney General next year. He's been commenting on the situation, so we'll get a citizen's and a legal perspective on what's going on in Foster. All right, let's bring on our good friend, Dr. Andrew Bostom. Andy, welcome back to In the Dugout. It has been a momentous few weeks. To this we've come. Everything we feared seems to be happening, and happening without appropriate scientific data backup.
No, I'm kind of, I mean, I guess a lot of it seems that it was moving inexorably to where it is now, but it's just happening faster than I thought. And I think it came home to me when I was at the East Greenwich School Board meeting, and it's really snowballed since then. With the governor feeling the need to issue this emergency order for the Delta variant, and then in conjunction with the state mandated masking of kids returning to school, and now with the FDA, the very rapid, and I think inadequate scrutiny that's been given to the Pfizer mRNA vaccine and its full approval, really well ahead of the traditional timeline. In the face, ironically, Mike, of the one feature that these vaccines could hang their hat on initially was their ability to reduce infections short term. And even that has come into question. So in the teeth of that,
So we're going to get into that
approval. It's just a whole concordance of things that are very disturbing, and very little pushback. I mean, it was reassuring to hear the comments that you were able to elicit from the, I guess, was she the deputy speaker? Or,
Deputy Speaker Charlene Lima.
Yeah, but it's these kinds of breakthroughs are few and far between, it seems.
Yeah. Well, political breakthroughs. All right, not breakthrough case. All right, so let's do this. Let's set a theme for the day, because I've got a ton of things to ask you about. People have been asking me to ask you, so I've gone out. I've found the headlines, and I want to ask you about it. And because wouldn't you agree? I mean, isn't it your biggest bone of contention that not only is much of these governmental and even corporate decisions that are being made not based on the actual scientific studies and data, but that the media is not reporting the real data, and that big tech is not allowing a lot of people to talk about the real data? I mean, even if they ended up making decisions you and I disagree with, wouldn't we at least agree that if we could have debates in the media and in government and in the public, legitimate debates with the actual data being presented and discussed, that at least the process would be better for all this?
Oh, absolutely. You know, when you look, for example, at the whole, again, Mike, in the scheme of things, it's a kerfuffle, but it's quite revealing. The situation where involving Cam Newton, and the policy of the National Football League, that here's a guy, I recall he was infected last October. He missed a game, and he's an intelligent guy, and so are others on the Patriots, and I'm sure a lot of these players were infected in the fall wave, maybe even in the spring wave, but certainly in the fall wave. And they're very reluctant to get vaccinated. And it's sort of a microcosm. I heard NFL, medical spokespersons discussing Cam Newton's case, and they're either completely ignorant of natural immunity, or they're worse. They're dismissive of it. And it should have been a policy from the NFL Players Association that either or. I mean, that's actually the policy now in the IDF. Israel's going through a crisis, Mike, which we can touch upon. But
yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. So
But basically, the Israel has decided, given what's actually going on there, which is a post-vaccination crisis now, that they have to have these IDF reserve training exercises, and they were excluding people who were not vaccinated. And then they realized, with all these breakthroughs, that they would accept, either being vaccinated or having prior immunity, and so reality has forced their hand to make decisions like that. And that's much more important than the NFL.
Let's hold off on more on that in a second. But I want to just reframe this at a high level. So when you mention the NFL, the IDF, we talk about government, the Department of Health. We talk about Nicole Alexander Scott, the health director in this state. And when you've commented so many times on this show about her and about so many others, Fauci and so many others, government entities, corporate executives, foreign countries, what they are saying is literally completely opposite of what you've been saying for the last 9 months. So it's easy to say, well, one of us must be wrong because both can't be right. But if you look empirically, Andy, Dr. Bostom, you've been proven right on almost everything you've said, from CT values to almost everything. So how can these supposed experts and these people in these positions be so damn ignorant?
Well, with Fauci, it's more subtle, more duplicitous, however you want to put it, because he has two positions on virtually every issue. With Dr. Scott, she's much more rigid. She'll say things like masks don't work, vaccine immunity is all that matters, and she won't budge from those positions. She's been ginning up the Delta variant in terms of its impact on children. Mike, as we speak now, the latest update from Health and Human Services, which is tracking all hospitalizations and breaking them down by pediatric and adult. Now, it's only hospitalizations with positive tests, so that doesn't tell you, with or from COVID, but it's the metric they use. There are 0 hospitalizations in Rhode Island as of noon today.
0 pediatric hospitalizations due to COVID.
0 in all of New England. As of 12:15 today, there were 12 in all of New England.
So all this hysteria over school masks, vaccine mandates, staff, all this hysteria about protecting our children, and basically what you're saying, again, I don't want to say no danger, but just to use a little hyperbole, there is no real danger ever was or is now, even with the Delta variant. Is that correct?
Mike, the hyperbole is all coming from these public health officials. They specifically stated that there was something different about the Delta variant in children. That is untrue. And I'll show you how duplicitous it gets. There was a headline about 10 or 11 days ago from Dallas in the Dallas Morning News.
And look at this headline too while you're talking. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, this is just nonsense. This is just nonsense. But around the same time, around this August 11th, maybe a little later, even in Texas, about the 15th of August, there was a headline story in the Dallas Morning News, and they talked about 40 pediatric hospitalizations. And the title, Mike, was COVID and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. When you dug into the story, I'm sorry, 44 hospitalizations. When you dug into the story, and remember, it says COVID first and RSV. When you dug into the story, 4 of those hospitalizations were COVID. So the preponderance were RSV. I mean, this is happening all the time. We are in the midst, I think it's starting to come down finally, but we're in the midst of a huge spike of respiratory syncytial virus out of season, which is a virus that affects kids basically under 5 years of age, and can cause very, very severe, like an asthma exacerbation kind of presentation. And it can be quite dramatic. And it has its own mortality in that age range. Looking at some older data of over 300 a year, just in the 0 to 5-year-old range. So it's a serious problem. And the fact is that it's so deceptive that they're trying to conflate the Delta variant, which is still having minimal impact on kids, with something that is quite serious, particularly in the youngest age group of kids, neonates to 5 years old, which is RSV. It's just awful that this is being done. By the way, we have a request in to find out how is RSV affecting Rhode Island. I got an alert yesterday, Mike. I get alerts from the Department of Health as a physician in Rhode Island. And they issued an alert for RSV. They didn't mention how many kids were hospitalized or anything like that, but I assume that means it's an issue.
So back to COVID. This hysteria with the Delta variant, again, is based on what you and I have often discussed, but I just want to reiterate it for anyone who might not remember or is new to the show, that counting cases was, and always has been a pointless exercise.
Absolutely.
Number of cases is largely irrelevant. In fact, in a way, if there's a high number of cases among healthy populations, the way it's turned out with this being so undeadly among healthy people, that's probably even a good thing. But this hysteria over cases, as if a case leads to death or severe illness, is false. And what's often overlooked, and the other theme that I want to make a constant theme for the rest of our hour today, that I know you believe strongly, is that even if you get it, even if you get sick, the treatments and therapeutics are so effective these days, maybe even more effective than the vaccine. I don't know. That's a question we'll get to. But aren't therapeutics the overlooked factor that
Absolutely.
That the media won't tell you about, big tech won't tell you about, government won't tell you about?
This is why I feel we're being manipulated in a very pernicious way. The day after the FDA approved the Comirnaty, the Pfizer vaccine, gave it full approval. And I want to talk just a bit about that. But before I get to that, the day after that approval, all of a sudden Fauci is gushing about monoclonal antibody cocktails and how effective they are for
a therapeutic,
for early treatment, a therapeutic, exactly. And Mike, I just want to say that the concerns that I have about this approval stem from the fact that it was supposed to be the most important Pfizer trial, the randomized controlled trial, was supposed to extend 2 years. They've approved it 13 months into that process. And worse, the trial itself was pretty heavily polluted by the time, certainly by the time we got to the 6-month point, in terms of total follow-up of the entire group of about 46,000. So roughly 22,500, 23,000 per group. At the point that they published the 6-month follow-up data, at least as a preprint, it hasn't, I've read it. I mean, it's online. Anyone can read it. It's not a full publication, although it's presented like a full publication. It probably will get accepted for publication. What was quite striking was that you could already see the declining efficacy in terms of their main outcome, which was only infection rates between the two groups. In other words, it was less than the original published trial at about 3 months. But even more striking, Mike, is that there were 29 deaths in the entire cohort of roughly 45 to 46,000, which is a small number, thank goodness, which is also quite interesting. 15 of those deaths were in the vaccinated group, 14 in the placebo group. So even 6 months out, you can't even begin to see a mortality benefit. And this is one of the fundamental problems with vaccines. Vaccines are never forced to look at long-term clinical outcomes like hospitalizations and deaths within the framework of the randomized controlled trial. You can do all kinds of post trial surveillances, and many of them are suggestive, but they're hardly definitive. In other words, within the context of the actual randomized controlled trial, and it's not unique to Pfizer, it's not unique to this vaccine, it's been done with the flu vaccines, but it's a problem. We never get data on these hard outcomes, just short-term ability to reduce infections.
All right,
That's not adequate.
All right, would you, I've been doing a lot of reading on this, and I've been reading some theories. Well, it's not even a theory. I guess they're, you tell me if it's true or not, but these are long time theories. And now as data is starting, you can't vaccinate your way out of a pandemic.
Typically it's,
has that been typical over history?
Typically you look at something like a seasonal flu, and then at the end of it, or right as it's clearly going into its more dormant stage, you can begin to generate the next vaccine, which will incorporate this new infection, this new flu that comes up. So it is unusual to try and vaccinate in the middle of a pandemic. It has been tried before, Mike. I mean, it hasn't been terribly successful, like with the 57.
I guess, but what I'm at, is that a radical theory that you can't vaccinate your way out of a vaccine, or is that a conventionally held piece of wisdom?
It just hasn't proved successful. I don't know how radical it is. It just hasn't. It hasn't proved successful. People have argued, well, that's because the vaccines weren't effective enough, and this is such an effective vaccine. That has not proven to be true, regardless of the theory, whether it's good or bad to do. I think what you're getting at is this idea, and it's been seen with a disease that affects chickens. It's also been seen with, I believe, with the dengue vaccine and one other vaccine in children, where you get something called antibody-dependent enhancement, and because the antibodies that develop are not neutralizing, you're actually allowing they're capturing the virus, and it's still being allowed to enter and infect cells, and that does not bode well in terms of the ability to control the disease. So there are these concerns, but regardless of the theory, in practice,
in this case,
Israel, just today, the COVID czar there announced that they're in a crisis, and it doesn't look like they're going to be able to vaccinate their way out of it. They're giving boosters. They've given them to 1 million people. But now, on the one hand, you could say, well, they already gave it to 1 million people. But in the short term, this is only 7 days or slightly longer post follow-up. They've already experienced 3,000 breakthrough infections, about 200 hospitalizations, and 15 deaths. And you would think if this was magic, if all it is just a little more vaccine, a little more antibody production, you would have seen nothing like this.
And it's not just the unvaccinated in Israel who are getting sick. It's the vaccinated too, right?
Yeah, it's still weighted because there is residual benefit from the last cohort of people who got vaccinated in Israel. It's very interesting, Mike. You can compare cohorts in Israel. The cohort that got vaccinated in January, February, March, April. There's already Israeli papers that have published. If you compare the April cohort to the January cohort, you see more than a twofold increase in the rate of infections in the January cohort versus
which means the effect is wearing off, right?
It's fading. It's waning. It's waning.
Do we have that kind of transparent data in America?
Not yet, not to the extent that they've done it in Israel, but we can see it happening.
Why the hell not? Why don't
LA County reported already, and it was a month-old data basically, that 30% of their infections were breakthrough infections from vaccinated people.
30%.
Yeah. So and obviously that's going to go up. Now, I don't want to terrorize people either, Mike. What's not changing, and what we need to stay really riveted on, the disease is not changing. It's still not, with all the Delta hysteria about children. I gave you the numbers. It's not changing. It's affecting the frail elderly and the morbidly obese. I mean, that is an unchanging dynamic.
Right, so I know you've been looking at the data. So pretty much as was the case for most of last year, you're saying that for most of this year, even with the Delta variant, that a large, 70, 80% of the deaths in this state are among elderly and in the infirm.
Absolutely, that's not changing. And do you have the ability to send you that Excel sheet that I sent you guys?
Oh, I didn't even see it. Sorry, Andy. Well,
okay.
We'll see if Larry can bring it up.
Okay, I sent you two things. One was just the sort of the transposing the data, the hospitalizations, the infections, the deaths on one slide, on one Excel spreadsheet. The other was just a raw Excel spreadsheet that Representative Chippendale put together, formatted as a data request that the Senate Minority Leader, Senator De La Cruz, is insisting that the Rhode Island Department of Health fill out, Mike. And what you'll basically see is it's just data that we're all entitled to see. It uses the age breakdowns that the Department of Health uses, all the way from 0 to 4 to 90 plus. The younger age groups are more granular. Then it just goes by decade by the time you get to age 20. And all we're asking for is broken down by vaccinated, unvaccinated, prior infection, no prior infection. What are the infections, the hospitalizations, and the deaths in all those age groups just for the period basically over the summer, July and August? There's no reason we can't have those data. Oh, the other thing we're asking for is comorbidity. We want to know if the person had up to 3 comorbidities. What are they? What were the major comorbidities? In a nice Excel spreadsheet for all the representatives of the state to review.
And then you and everybody else can do some appropriate analysis, and we can have some good public debate about all this, right?
Mike, I think it's so simple for these 2 months because, mercifully, there certainly haven't been a lot of deaths over the summer. There's been some hospitalizations.
Thankfully.
You could just look at the spreadsheet and say, aha, it's still basically a disease of the elderly. Kids are doing okay. People without comorbidities are doing okay. What's the hysteria about?
All right.
In a
but the media, nobody but you and us on this show in the Dugout will tell you about that. All right.
Mike, more important is that
we got to keep moving here.
We finally have some representatives that are interested in doing this.
I know. We'll just see if the state blocks them, though. I mean, like they block everything else. So, I appreciate them. All right. Look, it's confusing. For as much as the government is trying to tell you, and the left and big tech want everyone to think that the vaccinations are completely safe and they're a panacea and will cure everything and will end this. For as much as we see reports on that, I'll say from the left, there are also a lot of reports that seem crazy coming from the far right who are trying to tell us how dangerous vaccines are and not to get them under any circumstance and blah, blah. So I want to quickly go through. People are reading this. People don't know what to believe. I don't know what to believe.
Right.
So I quickly want to run through some headlines I've seen. I don't want to spend a lot of time on each, but just tell me, agree, disagree, maybe, just a quick comment on each. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So here's one I saw. Is the vaccine harming T cell immunity, which is something I know T cell immunity,
Right.
you believe is an important thing.
This, Mike, all I can tell you is this may be a misinterpretation of at least a preprint that I've read, which suggested that if you vaccinated previously infected people, that their T cell counts went down slightly. Now, that could just mean that they're redistributing for some reason in relation to
So
the vaccine.
killing T cells is probably an overstatement.
Right. If it's a count, they could be redistributing to tissue beds. So I don't know. I don't know what that meant.
All right. All right. You don't know. All right. Here's one, Robert F. Kennedy is a big
Right.
anti-vax mandate guy.
Right.
Here's a tweet he put out that was kind of shocking, that Oxford University says that those who are vaccinated are carrying significantly higher viral loads when they get infected, breakthrough cases, if you would, than those who are unvaccinated. How can that be? And is that at all true?
My understanding is that they can carry comparable loads, but not with appropriate comparison adjustment that they would be higher. But they certainly can. Vaccinated people can certainly carry very heavy, very high viral loads by the measure we have, which is cycle thresholds.
So do you still agree with vaccine proponents that at a minimum, while vaccines we're clearly seeing now aren't as effective in stopping the spread as we initially were told, but that you still believe vaccines will limit the chance of severe illness or death if you subsequently catch?
Right. So I would put it this way, Mike. I'd like to have firmer data on that, because, like I said, the only way you can really tease that out is within the context of a randomized controlled trial, so that even in the high risk populations that have been vaccinated, you don't have randomized controlled trial data to show not only are they possibly getting less infections, they're having better clinical outcomes than an appropriately matched unvaccinated group. However, the observational data that we have are suggestive on that score, that at least for the period of time, in other words, if the wave comes through, the variant wave, whatever it is, alpha, beta, delta, comes through at a period of time where your high risk cohort in your region is experiencing the peak benefit from the vaccine versus a comparable group that's unvaccinated in these high risk groups, it does look like at least for that period, they'll afford some benefit. How long that benefit lasts, whether it's confounded or biased by how common previous infection was in each of those populations, those things are not being teased out even well enough, even in observational studies. What I will say, Mike, is that in Israel, where they're much further down the road with all this, what is standing out spectacularly is that the people who are truly infected, now I'm talking about clinical outcomes, are the previously infected. Those people are doing better than anybody in Israel. That's pretty clear.
All right, here's a headline that really has some deep, if you read the story like I did. So two top virologists in Europe Their names are, let's see if I can find Dr. Luc Montagnier.
He got the Nobel Prize for his work in leading to the discovery
All
of
right.
the HIV
All right,
virus.
so credible people. Dr. Van den Bosch was the other one.
Yep, he's another vaccinologist, virologist.
All right. They're actually claiming that this massive vaccine push is making matters worse because of the limited way in which vaccines attack the virus, that it's helping create these variants,
Right.
and that even the vaccinated themselves become super spreaders.
Well, they certainly can. They can become, you're seeing if they're carrying heavy viral loads like that, and they are. I don't disagree that they are capable of carrying heavy viral loads. Obviously, they can spread. We're seeing some epidemiologic evidence of this. I mean, look at what happened in Barnstable County. I mean, 74% of the cases were people that were vaccinated, and that carried right through into the proportion of people, fortunately small, who wound up getting hospitalized. The preponderance of those people were vaccinated. So sure, I think the idea is that if you have a vaccine that's focused on the spike region only of the virus of SARS-CoV-2,
Those spike proteins, yeah.
the spike protein, if that's what it's using the cell's machinery to produce en masse, whether it's an mRNA vaccine or these adenovirus vector vaccines, which literally insert the gene for the production of the spike protein. But in the end, if the common denominator is that you're presenting to the immune system the spike protein, that's going to generate, a narrower immune response,
Right.
which
Than a natural immunity would, right?
than a broad-based natural immunity, and that's going to allow escape mechanisms for the viruses
Yep.
to
Well, that's
mutate.
exactly what they were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, my wording, it's almost like a dog. They're almost saying it's like a dog chasing its tail. That the more we vaccinate, the more these variants are going to be created that are going to be resistant to the vaccines.
The more they're going to,
which means we're going to be spreading new variants. The limited time you talked about, the fading effect, means that we never really reach herd immunity because of this.
Well, but I mean, again, if we realize that the truly vulnerable are staying the same, Mike,
Right.
then people are going to be exposed to these variants, and they're going to people that are healthy, people that are not susceptible to serious disease, are going to become resistant to these variants naturally. But yeah, I mean, it's look, we talked about going back to the beginning of when the vaccines were first introduced, and people could only speculate. I was very surprised that they adopted an approach which wasn't very targeted. Nursing homes, elderly,
Yep.
Diabetics, some high risk approach that I thought was going to be the approach, as opposed to this mass vaccination. And now I think it's pretty clear that was a problematic strategy to begin with. The idea that you were going to get COVID zero was
Right.
just preposterous.
And they both agreed with what we discussed earlier in reading that article, that
Well, I think
therapeutics really should be the thing.
Oh, absolutely. But I
pushed.
think there's something sobering to be learned and not have so much hubris about, which is the experience with flu vaccines. Now, one of the advantages of flu vaccines is that they do take, a more whole virus approach. They use inactivated flu viruses. But the truth is, and by the way, they genuinely appear, even using the vaccine adverse event reporting system, which we've talked about, they genuinely appear to be quite benign. Okay, so above all, do no harm. The reports into VAERS from the COVID vaccines are like an order of magnitude more alarming than anything you get from flu. But what we've learned with 30 years experience now from the flu vaccines, and obviously people in infectious disease have known about this. I don't know why they don't talk about it more. But my area of expertise has always been cardiovascular disease and chronic kidney disease epidemiology. This last 2 years or so has been, a new learning experience for me. I used to reflexively give to my cardiac rehab patients, flu season, I used to reflexively recommend that they get a flu shot, based on their increased risk. And now I'm not at all clear, based on 30 years worth of evidence, again, because the flu vaccines were introduced by the same paradigm as the COVID vaccines. You show a short-term benefit in a randomized placebo-controlled trial in terms of reducing infections. You're not required to show that they actually reduce long-term hospitalizations. They actually reduce flu mortality.
Okay.
And yet they're given out, and now it turns out that amassing this data over 30 years, whether it's a huge report out of the UK, huge reports using American databases, published in JAMA, the UK report published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, we can't find a benefit of in terms of hospitalizations and deaths.
All right.
So
the
it's very disconcerting when you see that, and the temptation is we're still giving flu shots, and the hope is that there's some benefit. But I'll tell you something else that's a little perverse about it. Even in these major papers that have conceded they cannot find a benefit in 30 years worth of data, 20 years worth of data, in studies involving 7.5 million deaths, 170 million hospital encounters, they can't find evidence of effect in 55 to 75-year-olds. Do you know what they conclude at the end of these papers, Mike? Like they're grasping at straws. Perhaps it's because we haven't vaccinated enough children against the flu. I mean, I don't know how to deal with that. This is
well,
new
this
to
is
me.
this is the frustration, right? This is the frustration that, and again, I'm going to make an analogy here that I think is pretty accurate. The perfect analogy here is the climate change and the global warming hysteria, right? There is some scientific stuff going on. There was some warming last century. There is a virus out there, but then conclusions are drawn, the political narrative is established, and then any science that refutes those quickly drawn conclusions and narratives gets ignored. People who talk about that science, like you, get belittled for not following the political narrative, and it leads to bad, maybe even deadly public policy. And there's this hysteria out there on both of these issues, and there's this actual denial of science, denial to even debate. I mean, clearly, right? Wouldn't you agree that in both? I know you look at a lot of political issues. Clearly, the science is not settled when it comes to vaccines, when it comes to masking, when it comes to climate change. But yet, we're not allowed.
Right.
The media does not allow us to have a real, honest debate on this stuff.
Yeah, well, I've referred to it as sort of a revival of Soviet era Lysenkoism. Lysenko was the agronomist slash geneticist who was Stalin's favorite, and despite the fact that his theories were disproven, and his experiments were so disappointing that he literally would have lectures after the war, after World War II, that were attended by European scientists, and they saw these beautiful looking tomatoes that were allegedly grown, through his processes in his lab. Again, this is agronomy, and one of them took one home out of the room because they weren't allowed inside the laboratory. It was made out of plastic. I mean, but opposing Lysenko, you wound up in the gulag.
Yeah. Yeah. And so worse than the opposition is those who just believe one side of the science, like President Biden, like Governor McKee, who are, I mean, this is outrageous headline. Biden urging businesses to put in vaccine mandates, papers.
Right.
To this we've come, and it's not science-based, Dr. Ball.
Well, look, Mike. I mean, look at it. I mean, again, I'm sorry to perseverate on this, but go back to Israel. their COVID czar is admitting a crisis. I mean, they're at least forthright to admit that. And there's no more vaccinated place in the world. And they're already doing, their third shot, and they're still having a crisis. It's a small society. It's a densely populated country, but there are lessons to be learned there. And I think you mentioned before, but we really need to emphasize the point that there's been a de-emphasis on therapeutics. All kinds of therapeutics, whether it's new, monoclonal antibody cocktails, or whether it's repurposed drugs. Israel, again, this is maybe pie in the sky, but Israel repurposed a triglyceride, a lowering drug, a drug that lowers circulating fats, and I've used it as that was one of my specialties when I was practicing, was treating cholesterol and triglyceride disorders. It's a very cheap, inexpensive drug. The theory was, first of all, we're seeing all these obese people that are presenting with severe disease. They have disturbances in their ability to metabolize triglycerides. Here's this triglyceride lowering drug, which may have some anti-inflammatory properties, and maybe more specific anti-inflammatory properties that are unique to disturbed metabolism of these blood fats.
And these anti-triglyceride drugs are working in Israel?
Well, they just reported on 14 consecutive patients who were in extremis, who had severe disease. Within 3 days of being treated with this traditional triglyceride lowering drug, they made a remarkable recovery. Obviously,
so again, therapeutics.
Right. But obviously a lot more work needs to be done. But for heaven's sake, if fenofibrate, which is, it's a somewhat useful triglyceride lowering drug, but not a terribly important drug. But if that can have a role in, even if it was just a niche population, which unfortunately is not that small a niche of obese people who are presenting with bad COVID, I mean, that would be remarkable, Mike. Yep. You might even be able to rescue people who are not that healthy going in.
All right. I'm going to keep moving on. We got about 10 minutes left, cover a few more topics. So I want to move. So I'm going to quiz you here. Quick quiz. One state has banned companies from requiring vaccines for its employees. So we want to honor and celebrate that state. Do you have a guess?
It's either some state it's either some red state in the West or the South. I would
You are correct. It is the state of Montana.
Okay.
Has banned. Now, a lot of states have talked about it. Some governors have talked about it, including DeSantis in Florida. But Montana so far is the only state to actually take that step. So hats off to them. Okay. Masking.
Okay.
So you're aware of, I assume, the pushback from the town of Gloucester. Are you familiar with that story that happened earlier this week on Monday night? Pardon me?
Yeah, it's where I live, yes.
Oh, that's right. You're a Gloucester resident. So, in fact, we're going to be talking with a resident of Gloucester tomorrow and a lawyer on what that town school committee did on Monday evening. Here, I'll just show this as a backdrop. You don't have to comment on directly, but the issue is mask mandates going back to school and kids and parents groups. Probably more, since McKee issued his new declaration of the state of emergency, since he issued his mask mandate himself, and since the Board of Education announced its, that school districts could be punished if they don't issue mask mandates. I've never seen parent groups so upset, but apparently the town of Gloucester was not so inclined to go along with these things. And excuse me for scrolling along. I was trying to find the article, but I can't find it. But they basically are defying the governor and the Department of Education. They issued a mask mandate, but they put it so full of holes, religious exemption, medical exemption, conscientious objection exemption, that basically any parent that doesn't want to have their kids masked, they say doesn't have to be masked. Your thoughts on all that?
I think it's great. because my bottom line is we have all the randomized controlled trial evidence in 18 years old and above populations. So adult, young adult populations. It's uniformly negative. There isn't certainly since 2008, there isn't a single randomized controlled trial of masking to prevent the community spread of respiratory viruses, primarily influenza, but other viruses, and at least one big study involving COVID itself. These studies that in total have included 18,000 people, again, randomized controlled designs, uniformly negative. And in fact, a parents group in the UK during the period before they were going to reopen the schools begged the British government when they heard that the guidelines were going to include masking for reopening the schools in the spring. They begged for there to be a randomized controlled trial in kids, and the government refused and just imposed, the mask mandate. So there isn't even a trial that's ever been done in kids. Mike, there are all kinds of observational studies, none of which really show any sort of benefit of masking kids. However, going back to SARS-CoV-1, the epidemic, the much more localized epidemic that occurred primarily in East Asia, there was a very interesting and somewhat depressing paper out of Hong Kong, which showed that particularly for the younger kids, and that was a much shorter period, within a period of just a few months, they saw a rapid deterioration in socialization amongst the younger kids, certainly that were masked, and difficulty in figuring out language. These are not small issues. I've also seen at least one randomized controlled trial. I believe it was in 7 to 14-year-old children, very short term. You're literally talking about randomization to 5 minutes of wearing a respirator, an N95 mask.
Yep.
Okay. This was a study, not the one that was removed, that was published in JAMA and then removed. This was a study I had not seen. This was a randomized controlled trial done, I believe, in Singapore, and putting a kid into a respirator for 5 minutes versus a control period caused they're measured in the mask. They're measured carbon dioxide content in their blood, done non-invasively, to increase during both rest and during exercise. 5 minutes. So and you must have heard these ideas too being floated around that, oh no, kids shouldn't just be wearing these cloth or paper masks. They should be wearing respirators. That'll solve the problem.
But again, it's chasing the wrong problem. They're trying to stop the spread or the number of cases. Again, we're not focusing on the right. Kids aren't the problem.
Exactly.
Kids aren't the risk. It's the adults.
They don't
home.
even.
So again, it's all
right.
Chasing the. I don't want to say it doesn't matter if your young kid gets COVID or not. I don't want to go that far, but there really isn't much danger. So again.
Mike, unless you have a developmentally disabled,
right,
with some predisposition, this could be more of a concern with you. If you think it's going to help your kid to wear a mask, then let them wear a mask. I don't think even that kid's going to be helped by it, and it might cause problems, but that's up to the parent.
So here's yes, it should be up to the parent. Even Representative Lima on our show said that yesterday. I don't know much about this group, but I saw this. Apparently there's some probably going on just a little while ago today, and then Saturday again, a group, Rhode Island for Freedom, Not Force, opposed to mandate. So it's going to be a rally that you could still go to on Saturday. Parents groups are pushing back. It's not just in America about mandates, but I want to show this image of French, just big protests in France about all these, whether it's masking or passports, but people have had enough of government interfering in their life. People are reading the emails. People are watching the cable shows. People are getting the website links of all this other data that's out there based on legitimate, controlled scientific studies that the media just refuses to inform the public about, but they're finding out about it anyway. And it's leading to, I think, stronger and more boisterous opposition to these government tyrants who just want to run every aspect of our lives. Final word to you, doctor, on just this we know best mandate tyranny that's going on out there.
I mean, Mike, all I can hope for is that some of our representatives at the local level, all the way up through state level, and certainly and Congress, continue to press for a rational discussion of all these issues. I mean, that's the public has to do it. You can't just shirk your own personal responsibility. But I hope that it translates into elected officials taking these matters more seriously, and not just being drones who basically accept uncritically these dictates, and because it's leading us to a bad place, bad for our physical and mental health, and bad for our really jeopardizing our freedom, our basic freedom and our freedom to think rationally.
Yeah.
And not just have to accept the latest diktat from Fauci, who changes his mind every 5 minutes anyway.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Bostom, thanks again for your time today. We'll have you back on real soon. I mean, we're reaching a critical mass here. To this we've come. And thank you for providing the other side of the debate. Dr. Andy Bostom, thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye.
All right, before I close out, everyone, I just want to share with you just quickly just 3 extreme cases of what's going on around the world. I mean, just how crazy the hysteria is, and some people are about this. All right, so here's, you probably saw this on the cable news. Here is the former director of the CIA agreeing with a tweet that Trump supporting unvaccinated should be sent to Afghanistan, presumably to be captured, tortured, and or killed by the Taliban. This is the former CIA director, Michael Hayden, saying that's a good idea. And it's these insane people that are driving public policy, and they call doctors legitimately and proven correct, like Dr. Bostom, crazy, and they call me, for someone who gives Dr. Bostom a platform, crazy. But you tell me who the crazy people are. Australia is insane with their lockdowns. 1 death, a handful of cases in the whole country. And they're forced lockdowns. I don't know if this is true or not, but this is a post. Look at this. They're building a quarantine camp that will be completed later this year. It's presumably, if you're found to test positive, we're going to send you into a concentration camp of some kind. And then also, this is Australia. They're killing dogs. Why? Not because dogs are infected, but because some people want to adopt these dogs at these animal shelters. But Australia doesn't want anybody leaving the house. They don't want people leaving to go to the animal shelter to pick up their rescue dog, because they might spread the infection. So they're killing the dogs so that people won't come. You tell me who the crazy people are. You tell me if we're having an honest and open debate about all the data and all the science and all the studies out there. And you tell me if any of this public policy, these papers, if to this we've come moment is at all justified. You tell me. Tomorrow, the town of Gloucester told the governor and told the Board of Education or the Department of Education, no, we're not going to comply with your ill-advised, ill-informed mandates. We'll be discussing that tomorrow and then the Dugout at 5 p.m. So for today, I bid you adieu, and we'll see you tomorrow for In the Dugout. Mike Stenhouse.